Hello, welcome to Mckinley. Today's video is about our control panels. These poor puppies have been with us for 20 years. They need a refresh and an upgrade. In this and the subsequent video, we're going to take you through our journey with the panels. The first thing is to describe how we use them today, what they do, whether they work or whether they don't. That's an interesting point. Finding a design, what would work for us? What's the right kind of thing? Is it important to go to touchscreen now, or do we stick with panels? We're adding freight to all that stuff. How's that going to work? What have we got to do to make it easy for our operators to use these panels? And then finally, in the second video, we're going to focus on Sheffield and tell you the journey, and you can see for yourself the results. So let's look at Manchester as it stands today. The current station panels that we have here, they all follow the same logic. There are two essential components that are important in our world and they work. These are the interlock buttons and these are the platform release buttons. The interlock is used to tell the computer to keep out of a certain area of the station. We have whole of station, goods reception and the sidings. We actually need an additional one for this station, we never put it in. Once you've got the control in place for that, the computer can't enter into those areas. And then we also enable and disable the platform, so to speak. So if this is on, the computer can take a train out of it or put a train in it. If it's off, the computer can't access that platform. It works really well. These panels have been incredibly reliable. They've worked for 20 years. The trouble is they are showing their age. It's really grubby. Look at all this, the oil stains. And also, they're not particularly upgradable. I can't clean these panels. I can't change the fascia at all because it's all stuck down with bits and pieces on this here. So that was an interesting problem. It's not very aesthetic. In all our crossovers here, you can see that we've got 2 switches and 4 LEDs. And most of my operators keep saying, why don't we just have one switch, David? You're never going to do it any other way. Never occurred to me when we put this in the first place, did it? So they're hard to keep clean. We've got to do things and we've got to try and find some way to make it work. The interesting problem we have with this is it's very crowded and it's also very lopsided. If you notice, this side of the panel is quite empty and this one is very dense. In finding a design, there was an interesting challenge. Do we use touchscreen technology? Well, on the face of it, it's an awful lot simpler to use. There's no wiring, there's no soldering, there's no LEDs. It's easier to make changes. So there's a lot going for it, isn't it? And we're using touchscreens with the iPads on the railways. The problem I have with it are 3 things, I suppose. The first is, let me put that down. The first is, we don't have touchscreens that have the highest level of resolution that you can get with a printed panel. And odd as that might sound, if you go and look in the market, getting large touchscreen devices, the iPads stop at a certain size and the touchscreen computers stop at another resolution. And when we looked at those things, that isn't particularly good. The second thing is, I don't have a technology that links in with LocoNet easily. And the final thing is a personal choice is the tactile feedback of buttons. I've tried touchscreen cars like the new Audis and I had a look inside one of those Teslas and they're all touchscreen, fantastic. But you need to visually follow it through and press it. You've got to consciously press it. You think how many mistakes you make on your iPhone when you're touching stuff, you think you've done it and you haven't. It doesn't engender confidence. And so I took the decision to say, I want to stick with physical panels. So then the search was on to find something. And I went to a great show that runs along the Great Central Railway in England. And it's a series of model railway shows along the railway line. And I went with Steve. And there I saw this exhibitor, Megapoint Controllers, and he had some display panels on there with all of his hardware. And this guy had really thought about how to build panels. He really had done a great job. The wiring was plug and play, the panels were beautiful, and he developed this technology. And I fell in love with the visual interface. And there's one in particular he had as a demonstration panel called Ollerton South. And I've got a picture of that to share with you. So full credit to those guys. My problem was it doesn't support LocoNet. So I had to go around and develop this whole thing myself. I also have a preference to the kind of toggle switches that we're using, but I'm going to come to that in a moment. So I had the design and I knew what I wanted to do, which was a physical panel. So then the next step. The design of the boards that Megapoint Controller uses is really clever, but the first thing I want to just touch on is my favourite little switches. We use these on London and Manchester. They're centre off, just push on each way. So there's sort of an off with the on each side. And notice they've got this locking bezel here. And I'm in love with these because it's great feedback. And I wanted to find a way to use this technology. So let's just explain how this technology or the design the Megapoint controllers uses. And they are great designs, but I adapted it and improved it. Basically, they use a single piece of MDF about 4mm deep, and they use this plastics, this Perspex, which is a double layer composite. And it's opaque at the rear and clear on the front. And basically the laser cuts through the lines and cuts out the holes for the switches. The lines and the circles are for the LEDs and for the painted lines for the tracks to then shine through on the other side. So that's beautiful. But how do I incorporate my favourite little switches? Well, I came up with the idea of splitting this 4mm thing into two so that you could pin the two, you can lock the two switches in place. This piece goes over it, and notice how the locking washer is in place. So it then prohibits these switches from being able to turn or rotate, hold them in position. And because they've got a nut here and a nut here, it means we can adjust them down to the point where the bezel is only just protruding above the plastic. The other switches are the conventional ones we used before. I tried to find lighting versions of these, but couldn't. And they simply lock in. And the other thing to just quickly show you is that the LEDs, they're little 3mm LEDs, and they go into these holes, and they're push fit. We use a glue to just hold them in, a rubbery glue, and it looks like that. And the light from that LED will shine through that there to quite amazing effect. So that covers some of the aspects of the design. So, well, with that cracked and the little template board, we thought we had it matched, didn't we? Oops. We're going to talk more about Manchester in a minute, but we'd already generated a tactical design for Sheffield. And so we produced a large A4 sheet of this plastic just to see how things were going. And we're using a small local company called Hey Create, which is next to MRS on Alder Hills. Great team. There's a guy called Harry there who really does work quite hard to get this thing working. We had all kinds of problems though, which he overcame, but it took us a few turns to get it right. And the kind of issues we had was that when we started to cut out with his laser etching device, it would overheat and the perspex would start to crack. He was cutting too deeply and too fast, or he had too much heat in the laser. And so it would, this stuff on the reverse where it cuts through on this side, the dust that it generates was clogging the holes back up, and then the laser was resealing the dust back into the plastic. He then got it cracked. So we did these large versions here, which we then used for different purposes, and Ivana will show you in the next video. But it was an interesting journey and took us about a month to find ways for the laser cutting device locally to produce the quality we needed. There's a crucial aspect to what we saw with that panel at the outset, which was the visual design of it. And that took an awful lot of work. In fact, that was actually the greatest piece of work. The hardware playing around was one thing, but getting the design right and getting all the information on screen so that visiting operators could come here and use our panels with a degree of intuition without having to go and consult a manual or worry if they're pressing the wrong button was an important point to me. And we spent an awful lot of time with our design team, we're about 5 or 6 of us, every Monday night over a period of about 3 or 4 months. And then also with a graphics designer, a local guy to us down here, Sam Clements, who was brilliant at doing what he does. And he had no experience in model railway design, but he cracked it. He soon got the handle of this. So let's take you through the key things that we needed to do on this railway. The goods yard down here On the existing design, there was no separation in the tracks, things weren't labelled. And so getting each of the tracks labelled was important. We also had to add the new crossovers. And if you notice here that we've actually put a single switch to control a crossover rather than the two we had on the old design. We've named the freight sidings as I've suggested. We've also added additional landmarks such as the signal gantry here and the signal gantry here, so that when an operator is looking at the physical layout and the panel, they get their bearings. The old panel used to have the engine shed, but it didn't have this massive wall going down here. And also, it didn't have any visual balance. It was just me hacking away at it 20 years ago. So with the help of somebody who's got a graphic eye, this thing quickly became adjusted. The actual size of this panel for the existing Manchester panel is pretty much the same width, but it's 30% deeper because we needed the vertical separation so that people could see things more clearly. We added the colours, as we've done here. Now in Manchester, the colours were to indicate the zones of the railway. The blue is the engine shed, the yellow was the sidings, the black was the main lines coming into the station itself. The colour design's a very complex subject, which we'll come on to in the next video and when we talked about colour blindness and things. But you get some idea. So we knew what we wanted to achieve here. The other thing we also decided we were going to add, which we haven't added to this panel, was short circuit indicators, so that if the operators are running a section of track and they hit a point the wrong way and it short circuits, they often can't hear the devices on the panel boards underneath the layout going click, 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 click. But if you've got a nice big red light showing up with a coloured zone that's appropriate to the sidings or the engine shed, it's a kind of a helpful tool. They can go, oops, I've shorted something. Oh, Mike, you've moved that engine onto the point. Drag it over. I didn't. Oh, someone's left it on a throttle. You know how it happens. It always catches us out. So this is all trying to make life simple and flow for the operators when they're running trains in an operating session. In part 2, we're going to cover the colour choices that we made, how Ivana got to make them look like this, and how we actually built Sheffield. Thanks for watching.